Yeah, and like that is kind of how, if you asked a medieval person what a witch is, they'd be like, oh yeah, that, because it's like a sexy lady who is gonna give me a boner, or maybe take away my boner. Like these are the two worries.
The only two options.
The two options. Okay, and there isn't like this medieval thing about being particularly worried about witches. It's just like, well, you know how sexy ladies are. Anyway, moving on. But then later on, Durer starts making these images of witches, which are like what you would expect to see now. So you have like a witch that is like riding. There's like an old witch, the very famous kind of one, is an old witch who is kind of like riding backwards on a goat. And you know, she's old and she's not sexy, underlined, you know, and she's holding a broom between her legs, while riding a goat backwards. And there's all these like cherubs being like, oh no, a witch. And like this becomes the popular idea of what a witch is later in the early modern period. And certainly by the time you get, you know, 100 years later or so the time you're making Vinegar Tom, you know, we're expecting to see old ladies and things like that. So Durer shows this shift.
My favorite example is from about 50 years later. This is my favorite woodcut. It's called the Bewitched Groom by Hans Baldwin Green. Do you know this? It was an amazing article about it in the journal Art History many years ago, which is called the article is called Art History from the Bottom Up, and it talks about arses in art history.
Yeah,
by Pat Rubin. But Baldwin Green's basically Groom Bewitched from 1550 or something around about there, 1544. It's the back end of a horse with a very detailedly rendered like butthole.
Yeah.
With a prone groom like in his armor, like completely passed out, with this like witch leaning in through the window, having just kind of done something to him. And it's very weird, and like lots of historical scholarship. It gets called by the Royal Academy, who have a copy of it, the most enigmatic image in Renaissance art. And it's properly weird because it has this like very detailedly rendered horse's butt, this drunk ass passed out guy, and then this kind of elderly looking witch with a switch leaning through the window. Out. Exactly. One titty hanging through the window.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right, when you see images like this, because we're now like, well, this is enigmatic. What does this mean? And I bet you people would be like, oh, you know, the old horse butthole magic or something like that at the time, right? Like this would be much more recognizable, I think, at the time of whatever is going on here, right?
Yeah, there's lots of arguments about its supernatural and its religious, you know, iconographic meaning. But I think this is the point, right, that you're making, that these get to be actually, because as almost the first mass media visual form in European thought, they get to kind of solidify ideas about gender and social hierarchy and magic and race and sex in ways that are still the iconic, you know, the archetypal ways that we think about all of these things.
Absolutely. And, you know, you can just kind of see this transition and progression of how we worry about women, you know, as one thing, and how we're worried about women in it's strictly a religious thing, mind you, of course, like obviously, and like and which women you need to worry about, like, so it's kind of like before in the medieval period, this is the troublesome nature of the sexy lady. Right. And like, that's what you need to kind of worry about. And then for early modern people, it's like, oh no, old ladies, you got to watch out for that, you know, which is interesting. And I mean, there is in both of these images, Albrecht Dürer's witch riding backwards and the bewitched groom, there is this kind of like vaguely sexual nature in them. You know, it's like, it is titty out, you know, the broomstick between the legs. There is, you know, like, why am I seeing this horse's butthole so much?
Well,
you know,
there's a great quote. This is from the art historian Joseph Kerner. So good. So he says, Staring into Baldung's abandoned, vandalized machine of representation, my eye is caught by the horse's anus. I'm pulled into this marionette theatre, not as a person, but as a puppet on the invisible threads of history and desire. And then Pat Rubin says, and this is my favourite quote in all of academic art history, does art history begin and end in a horse's anus? Sucked into a dark vacuum of ambiguous representation? Probably not.
I mean, I guess that what is the term for if a headline asks a question, the answer is usually no.
That's art history begin and end in a horse's anus. But that is through the kind of tongue-in-cheek telling of this by Kerner, this is about what woodcuts can do, right? It is this kind of sort of people's eye view. It's a much more vernacular form of representation than certainly had been seen in popular representations before.
And it's something that I wanted to ask as well, that you mentioned earlier on, that it was a much more kind of what you might think of as a democratized art form, and like it is segmented in terms of like who's doing what, but also they're probably more widely available. How much of what we can attribute of what we know about medieval life is from the fact that woodcuts now were able to depict like regular people's lives, not just being afraid of sexy ladies, but what people were doing day to day.
I mean, they're not documentary, right? At least not in this earliest version, but
yeah. So I mean, I would say shout out to medieval artists, because actually one of the cool ways that we can find before printing, there's an art trope in the medieval period that's called the labors of the months or the labors of the year, and it's one of the ways you can find out about peasants. Because they're like, in January, peasants do that. Well, actually, in January, the labor is feasting, because there's nothing to do in January and it's Christmas. But then, in March, you see like peasants plowing fields, and in July and June, they're doing like the harvest and they're bringing in wheat, and in November they're fattening pigs on acorns, and in December they're slaughtering the pigs. And so we get things like that, but what the wood blocks do tend to do is also they can be used for these audiences. Like, so when I was kind of like, well, I'll go look up some of my old faves, before the show. And funnily enough, a lot of the woodblock images that I like, our historians were out here talking shit. They were like, oh, well, this is a poorly rendered woodcut. And I'm like, shut up, because I do like the really blocky ones, but the really blocky ones, why they're near and dear to my heart is it'll be like, well, this is how you sew potatoes in, when potatoes are getting like introduced to Europe, right? And no one knows what to do with them, right? There'll be a woodblock image that kind of can show you that this is something. So even for an illiterate audience, you can use them for educational purposes. Like, who's doing the fucking crops around here, right? I'm interested in my homies with the crops. I'm interested in the art that's spurring them on, and you get cool things like that, right? So what I would say is that one of the things that woodblocks manages to do, it's not necessarily just convey to us the meaning of what ordinary people are doing, but it communicates with them, because the labors of the months, right, is not for an audience of peasants. It's for an audience of rich people. Yeah. Or they're like, what peasants are like? Am I right? Whose peasants be out there slaughtering pigs? Am I right? And it just is a really different way of speaking to an audience.